During the Gilded Age, masses of people immigrated into the United States. Some came to escape poverty, others came to avoid religious persecution, but all came to find a better future for themselves and their families. Altogether, more than 25 million immigrants surged into the United States between the Civil War and World War I through either Ellis Island or Angel Island. Ellis Island served as the entry point on the east coast of the United States, and most European immigrants entered through this island in the Hudson Bay River near New York City. But, unlike Ellis Island, which processed immigrants within hours or days of their arrival, immigrants traveling through Angel Island for weeks or even months at a time. Angel Island is situated in San Francisco Bay, and it was the main entry point on the west coast of the United States. Most of the immigrants that traveled through Angel Island came from Asian countries. When immigrants passed through these entry points, they had to become Americanized. Several theories have been created to describe how all of these people were admitted into American society. The melting pot theory can be traced back to 1782, when J. Hector de Crèvecoeur, a French settler in New York, envisioned the United States as a society where individuals of all nations are melting into a new race of men. Although it was slightly dated even then, this theory effectively describes how some immigrants did melt into the American culture. This theory holds true for many of the old immigrants, the first wave of newcomers who came between 1820 and 1870. These old immigrants traveled primarily from Western Europe. Many were Irish, German, English, or Scandinavian. But this melting pot theory has been criticized both as unrealistic and racist because it focused on the Western heritage and excluded non-European immigrants. So instead of the melting pot theory, the theory of assimilation is used to describe immigrants' entry into American society. This theory states that immigrants adopted the American culture, whether forced or by their own will, and they let go of most of their original culture. They assimilated into American culture. The second wave of immigrants, new immigrants, felt the full force of this assimilation theory. Unlike many of the old immigrants, these new immigrants hailed from Eastern Europe and Asia. So why did these theories not work for both the old and new immigrants? A majority of the old immigrants already spoke English, they could read and write, they practiced the Protestant religion, and accepted an established religion in the United States. They were skilled laborers, and they had previous experience with, or knowledge of, democracy. All of this made them quite similar to the U.S. citizens of the time, so their transition and acceptance into American society was smoother than those of many new immigrants. This transition was not so easy for the new immigrants because they came from foreign lands that had cultures and languages distinctly different from those in the United States. And compared to the old immigrants, many of the new ones were unskilled laborers and had little to no knowledge of democracy. But the masses of new immigrants fueled the ongoing industrialization of America. These immigrants were put to work building railroads, operating machines in factories, and working other low-wage, physically demanding jobs. But some Americans weren't willing to accept these new immigrants or their traditions, and these Americans were called nativists. Why weren't Americans accepting these people? Unskilled laborers already in America now faced competition from the unskilled immigrants willing to work for very low wages, because nearly anything was better than the wages they left behind in their homeland. And religious leaders were faced with a dramatic increase of non-Protestant believers. Many nativists were labor unionists who worked these low-wage jobs. These nativists formed the American, or Know-Nothing Party, which was the political party that tried to push anti-immigration acts through Congress. Although the nativists succeeded in passing several acts to limit immigration through Congress, it wasn't only their efforts that helped these bills pass. People began to see these new immigrants as foreigners trying to take over the U.S., and in fact, these immigrants did take over American people's jobs and completely transformed sections of their cities. Chinese immigrants and other ethnic groups separated themselves within city limits because they didn't want to assimilate or even melt. And they transformed the poorer parts of cities into Chinatown, Little Italy, and other areas dominated by the presence of their ethnic group. And these poor regions of cities, even if not dominated by a single ethnic group, were the primary reason Americans began to associate many of these societal ills related to urbanization, such as overcrowding, the spread of disease, and lack of jobs, with incoming immigrants. One of these acts that passed Congress was the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, and it barred all Chinese immigrants from entering the U.S. Keep in mind, Chinese people continued to enter the U.S. illegally. Most of these Chinese traveled through Angel Island and into California, so the Chinese Exclusion Act had its greatest influence on that region of the U.S. Later, in 1924, President Coolidge signed the National Origin Act, also known as the Johnson-Reed Act, which established a quota to limit the total number of immigrants allowed into the U.S. per year. This meant that the amount of immigrants from different regions of the world would be capped at a certain point, and then no more people from that country would be admitted to the U.S. that year. For example, it reduced the annual number of Polish people from 95,000 to 10,000, and between 1924 and the years immediately following World War II, the total immigration was down below 3 million people. But this act was lopsided. The number of Western European immigrants allowed far exceeded those of other parts of the world. This fact goes back to the idea of old and new immigrants. The old immigrants were more accepted by Americans versus the new immigrants, so this legislation reflects a continuation of that idea. Then, in 1929, another National Origin Act was passed, and it limited the total number of immigrants allowed into the U.S. to only 150,000 per year. While these diminished numbers benefited the working-class Americans, the big business industries suffered. For example, the railroad companies lacked the Chinese workers they had used to extend their railroad lines before the Exclusion Act. Builders needed workers to complete all the manual labor required, and factories needed workers to run their machines. Immigrants had taken over the undesirable jobs, but these jobs now needed to be filled. Immigration during the Gilded Age dramatically increased and then was forcefully abated by the government, but the immigrants that made it into America have left an impact that is still seen and felt today.